Hi, thanks for being here. My name is Zara, the author of the Argolicus Mysteries, and today I'm talking about process for the grain merchant, which is currently a project on Kickstarter. And process for the grain merchant. I need to turn this off. There. Okay, so sorry. And I have questions for people who are backing the project on Kickstarter. And so I wanted to address those questions today. Okay, one question is, how many drafts do you write? And the way that I work is a little bit different than this draft and that draft and that draft. So when I go in to work on my story, I write, whatever is coming into my head. And then when that is done, I try to leave it at a place where there's a question or an action that has to happen next. So it's easy for me to get right back into the story the next time I go to the manuscript. Then the next time I go to the manuscript, to help me get into the story, I look at what I wrote yesterday and I go through and I mark any places that I think need some fixing, or I need to add a dialogue line or add an action or take something away. I don't do those edits. I just mark them. And then I start in writing for that writing session. So the the draft is edited as I go along. It's hard to explain. Then when the draft is done, the manuscript is done, I go through and find all those places that I've marked where I need to add things or change things, and I work on that. And then I have editing software, and I run the manuscript through the editing software for syntax and grammar and all kinds of things. And I make those little tiny changes. And then I do text to speech listen, because it's really hard to catch the things that you have written yourself. So you may miss things like, well, I do, miss things like double the man walked to the door, whatever. And hearing another voice read it while I have the manuscript up in front of me helps me catch those little tiny things. Okay, so then the manuscript goes off to the editor, who looks more at syntax, but also looks at story structure and makes any suggestions about additions or changes to the overall story. And then the editor's suggestions come back to me, and it's up to me to make those changes or not. But usually with a wise editor, you want to take a serious look at their suggestions and make those changes. Then the manuscript goes back to the editor for what most people think of as editing, the commas, punctuation in general, and spelling and things like that. So it's a process. So for drafts, 3 big drafts, but all those editorial changes along the way. I hope that clarifies how that works. And then the next question I have is from a backer at the Kickstarter. project for the grain merchant, and her question is, if the project is short of full funding when the deadline is up, will you personally fund the rest of the money needed? So I thought the best way to answer this question would be to review how Kickstarter works. So let's take a look at that. Sorry for the infinity screen, but let's take a look at how Kickstarter works. So Kickstarter is a crowd-funded project, and that means multiple people pledge dollar amounts to support the program. And in this case, it's, excuse me, editing for the grain merchant and also some work on the cover for the print book and also delivering books to the backers. So backers pledge at a dollar level to raise funds for the project. And then they are charged if the pledge goal is reached. And also the project lasts a certain amount of time. In this case, it's 30 days. We started on January 7th and it ends on February 6th. So if we reach the goal in the time frame, which in this case is February 6th, all systems are go, manuscript goes off to the editor, uh, the paperback book cover gets designed in a template, and there are funds to send books to backers wherever they are in the world. However, if the funding goal is not reached by the end of the day, backers are not charged. So that means there are no funds. So there isn't a difference between how much was raised in the project and then do I need to match the rest of it. There is no difference. It's either all there or not there. So I hope that clarifies that question. So that's how Kickstarter works. And so yes, it is important to pledge within the time frame because the clock ticks. Otherwise, if the project does not get funded, then it's up to me to raise the funds to do all those things. So I hope that clarifies that. Okay, and now for the big question, which is multi-part, and that was, murder was not a crime at the time of the story. So why was murder not a crime, and how did people decide to deal with it then? And what were the impacts on the community when murder was not seen as a crime? So let's talk about what that means. In Roman law, which was in place for Italian citizens, quote, Romans, in Italy at the time of the Ostrogoth king Theodoric's rule, Roman law continued to apply to Roman citizens, Italians. So justice was a private matter because under the law, murder was not a crime per se. So families led by the family leader, the paterfamilias, made decisions about recompense for killing. So if a family had money, they could sue the perpetrator in a court of law. Of course, they had to know who that was. And that, of course, is the job of the hero in these stories, Argolicus. He helps people find out who it was that actually did the murder. There was no recourse for the poor. Justice was not equal. And unless you had a lot of money, there was no way to sue in a court of law. So, and I addressed this in a previous story, The Peach Widow, for a farming family, where there is a murder, and what happens to the perpetrator when there's just no money and no legal recourse. Um, there are two exceptions to murder not being a crime under the law. Um, One which we have to deal with in today's Western culture is that if somebody killed someone else's slave, that wasn't seen as murder. It was actually a crime, but it was destruction of property. So it was what we would call today property law, wasn't murder. And so they had to pay for the value of that particular slave. And then the other was if a murder um, impacted the public good, then it was a public crime. But it's kind of complicated. So let's take the example centuries before of Caesar being stabbed by 60 senators. According to the Senate, Caesar was not good for Rome, and none of those people, none of the senators, um, had any legal repercussions for that assassination. So it was a law at the time. Now, at the time of these stories, as I mentioned, Theodoric was king of Italy, and there were a number of Ostrogoths living in Italy. Um, they received, when they conquered Italy, the Ostrogoths received a third of all the property in Italy. Often that was just tax income. They didn't actually receive land, but for many, they did receive land and property. So the Romans had to give up a third of what they owned to the Ostrogoths. But and the Ostrogoths were ruled by what we would call a tribal code, and a man's life was valued as a financial loss. So when the murderer was known, they were required to pay the family a life value, and it could be money, it could be land, it could be livestock, or whatever the family claimed as that life value. Um, I just wanted to point that out, that there were two systems of law in place in Italy at this time. For these mysteries, we're mostly dealing with Roman law and finding who the killer was, and also trying to figure out ways to deal with a killer once they've been identified. So I hope that helps with answering that question. Yeah, it is a it's a very amazing thing that I discovered in my research. Part of it was in research, I contacted several Roman law attorneys, and unlike historians, they are not very forthcoming. Essentially, I was totally stonewalled, and I had to keep going with my research to find out more. And fortunately, I found this book. Whoa, it's hard to see. It's backwards. Murder Was Not a Crime: Homicide and Power in the Roman Republic, which told me a lot about Roman law, about homicide. And it's just, we're so accustomed to thinking of our laws as the way it is. It's like, in different times, different laws applied. I do want to mention that. The scholar who wrote this book was Judy Goggin. And in case anyone wants to dive further into that, topic. And then let's see, we had another, I think there was another question under author. I don't know. I am not finding the third question, and I'm really sorry. Okay, so we talked about, oh no, we talked about drafts. We talked about how funding in Kickstarter work, and we talked about writing mysteries when murder was not a crime. Um, and hi, Rin, I'm glad to see you here. Thanks. Thanks for joining in out from way down under. All right. So, a lot of research goes into writing an historical mystery. And when I did my last update, I just totally forgot to read a chapter. So I thought I would do that today. And this research was based on town town council structure, and that was one of the points that I had to do just for this specific novel. And just a little background on that: I was looking for town council uh, structure at this particular time, and boy, there wasn't very much. And I finally found in a Spanish language journal an article written in English about the town council structure. And so I contacted that professor, who is Lynn Kirchen, who's professor emeritus at Waterloo University in Canada. And he was very, very helpful, pointing out what the structure was around that time, and also that we really don't know very much about that time. So I had leeway in things like how often the council met and some of the roles involved in the council itself. Um, so let me read from this scene when Argolicus first goes to the town council and gets involved in town politics after being away in Rome for several years. Argolicus slid onto a bench in the council hall amid nods from fellow town members. The long stone bench was one of two that edged the side walls of the meeting hall. The town principal sat in chairs arranged against the far wall on a slightly raised stone dais. He saw Sura in deep conversation with a graying man with squinting eyes. Argolicus tried to remember the man's name, but couldn't. In the years he had been away from Rome, it seemed as though the membership had dwindled. There should be close to 100 men here. As he did a quick head count, he realized there were less than 50 men in the hall, including the principals up on the dais. Wide spaces on the benches testified to members who were not there, and he understood now why Sura had invited him. Sura was waving at Archilicus, gesturing for him to come up to the principal's dais, mouthing, "Come, come." Archilicus hesitated, thinking he would just watch and observe in this meeting. But Sura was right. He was principal of the township and belonged on the dais. He rose and went to Sura. As he mounted the step up to the dais, all eyes followed him as he made his way to Sura. Not the beginning at the council he had imagined. He was in the thick of politics. All his misgivings from his time in Rome as prefect swirled inside his stomach. Father would not have been hesitant, but father had not experienced the Senate in Rome. But now he was his father's replacement heir, and it was time to take his place. Surus smiled. "You remember Donicus? He was our taxman before you left?" Argolicus now remembered the man who was grayer and squinted more than before. "Donicus," he said, keeping track of everyone and everything? Donicus looked up, squinted, and said, Argolicus, has your wisdom grown in Rome? Did you bring back knowledge you can share? I'm the last to hear any stories. Tell me you are now here in Sculace. I am. As you can see, this is my first time at the council since I left. Today I'm here to observe and learn. I have years to catch up, but I'm wondering why so many seats are empty in the benches. Donicus shook his head. Too comfortable in their country villas to come into town for business. Almost everything is left for us to decide. He waved at the group of principals on the dais. Everyone's role seems different now, Argalica said. Look at Zara, he's a magistrate. Zara expanded under his silks. Then he motioned for Argalicus to sit in an empty chair next to Donicus. Donicus nodded his head. Indeed, we need strong leaders. This year we have Vespasianus. He nodded his head toward the central chair on the dais. A tall man in a fine linen tunic sat with pomp, surveying the room. He turned his head, covered with dark, almost black hair, cut in a fashionable Roman-style cap, to survey the room, frowning at the empty spaces on the benches. Donicus continued, You see, we have leaders, but now we have... He was cut off as Vespasianus rose with pomp from the chair to begin the session. Citizens, we have several issues to discuss today. I'm hoping we can get through them with a minimum of discord. Vespicus Arius Macrio, our treasurer, will explain the new tax levies and how they will be paid to our governor, Venantius, as well as the funds to improve the warehouses and ongoing maintenance of our city streets. Donicus pulled out several vellum sheets and began reviewing columns of figures. Vespasianus continued, Caesar Roberius Donicus, our curator civitatis, will report on the success of the markets in general and the success of the grain harvest this year. We can all be grateful for our harvests. Donicus gathered several sheets of vellum and prepared to rise, but Vespasianus continued, Missing from us for several years on his appointment by the king in Rome, we welcome back Gaius Vitellius Argolicus. Heads turned toward the dais, searching for the new face. The town of Sculace is grateful for the leadership of his father, Gaius Vitellius Maximus, and look forward to continued guidance from Argolicus. Men nodded in agreement and then burst into brief but hearty applause. Argolicus rose and sat. A man swathed in silks rose from the benches and walked toward the dais to address the principals. Argolicus recognized his neighbor Bartholomeus, a man of strict principle and growing wealth. He nodded toward Donicus and Macro and then addressed the room, standing with defiant, widespread legs. We have an urgent situation that must be addressed today. Taxes. More immediate than warehouse improvements or taxes, I'm speaking of the unruly rabble disturbing our streets, defacing property, and causing civil unrest. In spite of our king, we have our eternal Roman laws. Argolicus saw some heads nodding agreement among the benches, but the principals on the dais seemed inured to tirades like this. Bartholomeus continued his impassioned rhetoric. We need the town warden to keep peace in the streets so we can go about our business undisturbed. A few calls of agreement murmured on the benches. Most importantly, we need to hear from the arbiters of the grain supply like Pompeius Severus Quintinus. We need to know why the town is short of grain when our harvest was good. Not only good, one of the best in years. Why are we short of grain? Who will quell the hungry mob? Where can we get grain now? I call on Quintinus to speak. The heads on the benches turned toward the dais. There was a hum of voices, and then silence. Argolicus realized the empty chair was not for him, but for the missing town principal, Quintinus. Around him, the principals muttered and exclaimed, sotto voce, "Where's Quintinus? Not him to miss a town meeting, just when we need him." While the principals flustered, Argolicus knew that he might see Quintinus this very afternoon. He had an appointment at his house, and he would ask him about the grain and why he wasn't at the town meeting. A scrawny man stood on the dais. His angular face held trace of Greek ancestry, not uncommon here in the South. "Perhaps I can give a brief explanation." Vespasianus waved his hand to the man to continue. "Citizens, Vibius Horatius, Bartholomeus, I'm not Quintinus, but I speak with him often about these matters. The grain harvest was plentiful this year. The weather was kind to the fields. There was suspicion about normal shipments to Ravenna and Rome from Egypt. Quintinus stepped in. He brokered almost all of the grain from here in the south to meet that demand in the north." Men grumbled on the benches. Several stood up to speak. Vespasianus turned his regal head from one side of the hall to the other. He held up his hand. "Let Sextus, Gabianus, Pinnus continue." Bartholomeus frowned. The men on the benches sat down. Pinnus continued. "Quintinus knows best where the grain comes from. He's in communication with the growers. The large estates and the small farms will need to wait for him to let us know if more grain is available." Bartholomeus interrupted. "We can wait. Meanwhile, something must be done. If we can't appease the people, the hungrier they are, the more they will turn to disruption. I call on the principals to settle this matter as quickly as possible." All the men on the benches stood. Cries of "Now!" and "Stop them!" rang through the large hall. Some raised their fists in anger, and others ran toward Bartholomeus and stood next to him in front of the dais. On the dais, the principals began whispering questions and shaking their heads. Thoughts and questions ran through Argolicus' head. Was Bartholomeus doing this as a play to become a principal? He was richer than some of the men on the dais, like Pinnus, the wine merchant, but he was not from an established family. And although he had property, much of his wealth stemmed from slave trade. And this crisis in the council, he had never seen citizens of Scolaci so out of order. They were as disruptive as the people in the streets, just in a different way. It seemed as if the entire town was erupting in chaos. Vespasianus rose from his chair and raised his hands. As he turned his head to look over the town membership, the men on the floor grew quiet. Those at the benches lowered their fists and hung their heads. One by one, the men around Bartholomeus returned to their places. Finally, Bartholomeus walked to take a place on a bench, and the principals on the dais were quiet. Vespasianus lowered his arms and said, "Citizens, nothing will be solved without order. We can discuss our situation rationally and reach our conclusions. Grain distribution cannot be solved until we hear from Quintinus. Let us, for the moment, continue with the other issues of today's meeting." He turned around and motioned toward Donicus. Argolicus stood. "I have an interim proposal." Donicus tugged at his tunic, waving the sheets of numbers in his other hand. Argolicus turned. "In a minute," he said. Vespasianus frowned, sure that Argolicus wanted to prolong the discourse. Men on the dais looked on with shock, and on the benches men murmured and furrowed brows. "Citizens," Argolicus continued, speaking to everyone in the hall, "in the matter of the grain shortage, I will speak with Quintinus. I have an appointment at his home later today. I recently returned from Rome, where I settled disputes on a regular basis. Correct information is the basis of sound decisions. Let me gather facts from Quintinus, our grain merchant. I will report back to the magistrate Vespasianus. If we need to confer with other principals of Squillace, we can do that once I have facts. Then we can set up a grain dispersal for the people. And once they know they have food, I'm sure their fractious behavior will subside. The men on the benches settled back. Heads nodded. Everyone on the dais turned toward Vespasianus. Bartholomeus frowned, but finally nodded in agreement. A reasonable solution, Vespasianus said. Once we calm the populace, we can return to regular town affairs and the prosperity of Squillace. We look forward to your answers. He nodded at Argolicus. Now let us turn to the matter of the tax levies. Okay, that was an excerpt from The Grain Merchant, which is now on Kickstarter. And I want to thank my backers for all their support and questions. Um, and then I just wanted to make a comment as a writer about the passage that I just read. For me, it is really, really hard to write one of those scenes when there's lots of people. You know, when two or three people are gathered together and in conversation, it's easy to track the back and forth. But when there's a lot of people, I really have to be careful to make sure that the reader can follow along with who's speaking, what's going on in the room, and how people are reacting. So that's one of my big challenges, is writing a scene like that with lots of people and lots of things going on. So I see there are no more questions. Just double check one more time. I see there are no more questions. So I want to thank everyone for being here today. And of course, you can post questions in the comments if you're here later on, and I will answer them in my next live appearance. All right. Thank you very much.